Hello and welcome to Nithrania YouTube channel. You're watching another episode of the Game in a Nutshell series designed for explaining the board game rules. My name is Branislav Berec, and in this video we're going to learn how to play 18Chesapeake. Now 18Chesapeake has been specifically designed as the introductory title for a so-called 18XX family of games. By being introductory, it doesn't mean that the game would be somewhat simplified. No, it's a full game with all the full features and rules you can find in other 18XX titles. It's maybe more forgiving and more friendly to new players. Before we start, let me say that the game comes with this paper money, and I would strongly recommend not to use these paper money, but use some poker chips instead. It dramatically speeds up the game. So in the video, you will see the chipset that I'm using in my games. So without any further ado, let's get started. 18XX series is a genre of board games that features creation and operation of the railroad companies in the 19th century. That's why the name 18 something something. Players in the game are investors funding these companies. They buy and sell these shares. They essentially build their portfolio, and then they receive dividends from companies operating on the map, and they hope that the stock price of those companies will rise. Those railroad companies then build the tracks, they build the stations, they buy trains, run those trains through these cities, which generates revenue, and that revenue is then paid to the investors and the share prices move up. That revenue may also be withheld in the company so that the company can buy more trains and generate even more revenue. The winner of the game is the player with the highest personal wealth, which is the sum of the value of the player's portfolio of shares and their personal cash. To set the game up, place all these share certificates on the designated space on the game board, sorted by the company, and with this President's certificate on top. Place all the trains with number 2 in the top left hand corner in this available trains area, and I like to have them spread out so that everyone can see how many trains are remaining in the pile. Then you can place all the remaining trains in this future trains area. However, I would recommend to place all the 3 trains spread out in this space and all the remaining trains nearby. Prepare the initial bank of $8,000 and give each player the starting cash from that initial bank based on the number of players in the game. So for example, in a 3-player game, each player would gain $800. Keep the remaining money near the game board visible to all players, because that's the bank and that's the game clock. When this bank runs out, the game will end. Place all 6 private company certificates near the game board and randomly choose one President's certificate that will be assigned to this private company number 6. Then you may use these cards to randomly determine the sitting order of the players, and the first player in the player order will receive the priority deal card or priority deal marker. The object of the game is to be the richest player at the end of the game. Your wealth is the sum of your cash and the value of your shares. In 18Chesapeake, and also in many other 18XX games, there are so-called major companies. These are public companies like NWR here or B&O. And since they're public companies, no player can own 100% of those companies. In that case, they wouldn't be public, they would be private. Since they are public, you can own a share of that company, and each certificate is 1 share, and 1 share is 10% of the company in this game. So if you have 3 certificates in the game, you own 30% of the company. Whoever has the most shares of the company is the president of the company. President always has this President's certificate, which is worth 2 shares, that's why there are 2 symbols of the company. So here, this great player owns 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% of the company. The president of the company always runs the company in the operational rounds. In addition to these public major companies, there are also private company certificates. These are small companies fully owned by the player, that's why they're private companies. And each certificate represents the entire company, so you own 100% of that company. The game starts with the auction of these private companies, And then there will be a series of stock rounds and operational rounds. This private company auction only happens at the start of the game. Players will auction all these 6 privates, and during the operational rounds, these private companies pay the revenue to their owners, and some of them also provide some special abilities. After this initial auction, there will be sets of 1 stock round and certain number of operational rounds. At the start of the game, there is only 1 stock round followed by 1 operational round. Later in the game, 1 stock round may be followed by 2 or even 3 operational rounds. Use this marker to track the current round of the game. During each stock round, players can only buy or sell these company shares. And although there's nothing else just buying or selling, big things may happen, new companies may be started, the president of the existing companies may change, and stock prices may drop significantly. Then, during the operational rounds, companies will operate, but only those that have started by now, and they will be operated by their president, and these operating companies may lay the track, they may build the stations, they will run their trains along their routes and generate revenue, and then they will either pay that revenue to the shareholders or keep the revenue in the company. As the last step of their operational round, companies will have a chance to buy more trains. The game will end when that initial bank will run out or when any player goes bankrupt. Then each player will count their cash and the value of their shares, and the richest player wins the game. The historical technological advancement is represented by depleting this train stack. As more and more advanced trains will be available, the game will also progress through these phases. The game starts with this phase number 2, the yellow phase, because there are only these trains with number 2 available, the yellow number, and there are only the yellow tiles available. Based on these numbers of trains, those trains are called 2 trains, 3 trains, 4 trains, 5 trains, and so on. When all the 2 trains will be sold out and the first 3 train will be bought, the game would move to the green phase, phase number 3, and with that, green tiles will be available. Similarly, when the first 5 train will be bought, the game will move to the brown phase and brown tiles will be available, or the russet tiles. And finally, when the first D train, the diesel train, will be bought, the game will move to the gray phase and the gray tiles will be available. Although you may move through these phases very quickly, in fact, each phase represents many years or even decades of the history. Therefore, the period of time that these phases can cover can easily reach 100 years of history. When you start the private company auction, arrange the private companies by their number in the top right hand corner. When purchased, each private company pays a small revenue to its owner, and most of them also have some special ability. These special abilities are described on the back side of the private company and also in the rulebook. The private company auction starts with the player with a priority deal and then continues in a clockwise direction until all players pass consecutively. On your turn, you have 3 options. You may either buy the cheapest company available, or you may bid on any other private company, or you may do nothing and pass. Passing doesn't end your round, so when the turn order comes back to you, you have again the same 3 options. When you buy the cheapest company, pay the value of the company to the bank, and then take the certificate. You are now the owner of that company. When you decide to bid on more expensive private companies, you must bid minimum $5 plus the face value of the company. Since this is a bid, you don't take the company yet. All the bids must be the multiples of 5. If the next player decides to bid as well, they may bid on the same company or on any other company. If they bid on the same company, their bid must be higher than the previous bid. In that case, make sure you can identify the bids of all players. You can, for example, use the tokens from the game. Or, if you wish so, you can use any other alternative. Now, when you decide to buy the cheapest private company, if there is at least one bid on the next private company, resolve that private company as well. If there is only one bid on that company, that player takes that company. If there is more than one bid on the company, players continue bidding, starting with the player with the lowest bid and then continuing to the player with the highest bid. Each player may either increase the bid or they may pass. However, this time, if the player decides to pass, they may no longer continue bidding. Then the last remaining player wins the company and takes the certificate. If there are no bids on the next private company, stop resolving these private companies and get back to the auction. Since it was the gray player who bought the cheapest private company and triggered the resolution of other private companies with the bids, the current player to act is the next one in a clockwise direction. When any player buys the cheapest company available and all the remaining private companies have some bids on them, all the private companies will be sold, and that's the end of the auction. Now, note the player who bought that last cheapest company, and again, the next player in a clockwise direction receives the priority deal for the stock round. The player who bought this Cornelius Vanderbilt private company with one presidential certificate must set the par value for that company. In our example, it's the company Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad. Use one of the company markers and place it in one of these three spaces. Par value is the price of the shares of that company in this initial public offering. The par value never changes, and anytime you buy the shares from this initial public offering, you have to pay this price. When all players pass consecutively before all the private companies are sold out, you will conduct one quick operating round plus one export. During this quick operating round, private companies will pay revenue to their owners, and that export means that you have to take one train from the available trains, so the cheapest train, and completely remove it from the game. Then you will come back and resume the auction again. If all players would pass consecutively again, repeat the same process, pay out the revenues, export one train, and come back to the auction. This would continue until either the initial bank breaks and then the player with the most money wins, or eventually someone will buy the cheapest available company. If there is a situation when all players pass, however there is no private company sold yet, the face value of the first private company is reduced by $5 from 20 to 15. Players immediately continue bidding, and if they would pass again, the face value of the first company is reduced by additional $5 down to $10 only. If this continues and the face value of the company is reduced to 0, the first player to act must buy that company for 0. During stock rounds, players buy and sell these shares, these certificates. They do it in turns, starting with the player with the priority deal and then continuing clockwise. In the first stock round of the game, on your turn you only have two options. You may either buy one certificate or pass. Similar to private company auction, if you pass and the turn order comes back to you, again you have the same options, you can buy a certificate or pass. However, you may never sell any shares in the first stock round of the game. In all subsequent stock rounds in the game, you may sell any number of shares, and then you may buy one certificate, or you may pass, obviously. Both selling and buying are optional, so you don't have to do both, but when you do, you must sell first and then you may buy. The stock round ends when all players pass consecutively, and again note the player who was the last one to sell or buy shares, and the priority deal goes to the next player in a clockwise direction. When you buy shares from this initial public offering, and you want to start a new company, the first certificate you buy must be the President's certificate. Take one of the company markers and set the initial par value. This is the value for one share, so when you buy the President's certificate, you have to pay double that value, because it's worth 2 shares. In this example, you have to pay $140 for this presidential certificate. Place it into your portfolio and pay the money to the bank. Then for any other share from the initial public offering, you only pay the par value, so $70 in this case. There is one very important rule: one player can never own more than 60% of one company. When you buy the president certificate of a company and you set the par value, this is called starting the company. However, the company is not operating yet. To do that, players have to own at least 60% of the company. That means that at least 60% must be sold from this initial public offering. It doesn't have to be owned by one player, it simply has to be sold out from the initial public offering. And those 60% of shares don't even have to be in the hands of all the players. When players sell shares, they are placed in the bank pool, but they are considered to be sold out from the initial public offering. So in this example, 1 share in bank pool and 5 more shares in the hands of the players is enough to make the company operational. The president of the company, that's the player with the most shares and with this president's certificate, gets the company charter, all these station tokens, and the initial treasury, which is 10 times the par value. So 800 in our example. The company will be operational in the next operating round. Now take one additional company marker and place it on one of these 3 initial spaces on this stock market, which corresponds to the par value. This is called floating the company because this market price will move right and left, up and down, so it will sort of float. But remember, this par value never changes. When you sell shares, you may sell any number of the certificates during the same turn. Let's say the gray player wants to sell 1 B&O share and 2 PLE shares. All the shares sold are moved to the bank pool. They are never returned back to the initial offering. Shares are sold for the current market price. Take the money from the bank and place it in your personal reserve. Make sure you always separate your own personal money from the money of the corporations. The market price then drops down 1 space for each share sold. When you sell shares of multiple companies, you choose in which order you sell them, because if you move the marker to the space occupied by another marker, the current one is placed at the bottom. This affects the order of the companies in the operating rounds. If the marker is supposed to move down, but it cannot, it doesn't move. Now, there are some restrictions for selling shares. First, you may never sell shares in the first stock round of the game. Then, the bank pool can contain maximum 50% of shares of one company. If it does, no player may sell more shares of that company until some of these shares are bought back. Then, the president's certificate may never end up in the bank pool. You may never sell that certificate to the bank. However, there is a way how to move the presidency to another player, and I will talk about that in a minute. Then, when you sell shares of a company, you may not buy the shares of the same company again in the same stock round. You may do it in the next stock round. And one last note, you may never sell private companies to the bank pool. The player with the most shares in the company is the president of the company and makes all the decisions for that company in the operating rounds. So, when you buy the first certificate of the company, it's always this president's certificate, so you automatically become the president of the company. Later in the game, if any other player gains more shares in the company, that player becomes the president. Having the same number of shares is not enough. You must have more shares. When that happens, the new president receives the president's certificate, and the old presidents will receive 2 single share certificates. The new president also receives the company charter from the old president. Then, when you sell shares, if another player has now more shares than you, that player becomes the new president of the company. It is effective immediately, so you have to exchange that president's certificate again. If there is more than one player with the highest number of shares, then the new president becomes the player which is first in a clockwise direction from the old president. One last example, if you have 3 shares of a company and another player has 2 shares, you can actually sell just 2 shares of that company. So exchange the president's certificate first and then sell those 2 shares to the bank pool. This way you may still keep 1 share of the company, but you transfer the presidency to another player. If there are any shares in the bank pool, you may also buy one share from the bank pool, and you buy the share for the current market price. Take the certificate, put it into your portfolio, and pay the market price to the bank from your personal money. That market price doesn't change when buying the shares. Remember, when you buy a share from the initial offering, you pay the par price. When you buy a share from the bank pool, you pay the market price. Over the course of the game, players may not buy as many shares as they want. There is always a certificate limit, which is different for each player count, and this number indicates what's the maximum number of certificates you may have. There are three types of certificates in the game. First, these one share certificates, then two shares president certificates, and also these private companies count as one certificate each. In other words, each piece of paper is one certificate. If the market price of the company moves into this yellow zone, the shares of those companies don't count to the certificate limit. If you have shares of such company and during the operating rounds the market price moves away from that yellow zone and you will have more certificates now than the certificate limit, in the next stock round you have to sell down to the actual certificate limit. The stock round ends when all players pass consecutively. The priority deal goes to the next player clockwise from the last player who took any action. So if the gray player would be the last one to do something, let's say buy this share, and then all players would pass, the priority deal goes to the pink player. If there are any companies which are now sold out, which means there are no shares in the initial public offering and there are no shares of that company in the bank pool, in our example it's only the PRR company, the green one, the current market price of that company moves one space up. If the token would be already at the topmost row, it doesn't move. After each stock round, there are a series of operating rounds. The number of these operating rounds is determined at the end of the stock round by the current game phase. In the yellow phase, each stock round is followed only by one operating round and then it goes back to the stock round. In the green phase, each stock round is followed by two operating rounds, and then in the brown and gray phase, stock rounds are followed by three operating rounds. This number doesn't change during the operating rounds, so if, for example, we are in the yellow phase and we have one operating round, and if during this operating round the game progresses to the green phase, there is still only one operating round, followed by a stock round, and only in the next set of operating rounds there will be two operating rounds. In each and every operating round, every private company in the game and each floated public company will operate once. Private companies pay revenue to their owners. If the owner is the player, that player takes the money from the bank, and if the private company is owned by the corporation, money goes to the corporation. You can resolve all these private companies simultaneously. After that, all public companies will operate one by one, and their operating order is determined by their market price. The company with the highest market price goes first, the company with the lowest market price goes last. If there's more than one company with the same market price, then the rightmost company goes first. If they are in the same space, they go from top to the bottom. During its operating round, the company may perform the following actions in this exact order. First, you may lay or upgrade the track. Then you may place one station marker. Then the company must run all the trains it has. Running the trains will generate revenue for the company, and then the president decides whether the money will be distributed among the shareholders or it will be withheld in the company. Then the company may buy one or more trains, and with that the operating round of the company is over. However, only during these green phases, anytime during the company's operating turn, the public company can buy the private company from its president. After the company completes its operating round, flip the marker to indicate that this company has already operated. Then it's the next company's turn. Once all public companies have operated, flip the markers back to their face side and move to the next operating round, or potentially to the next stock round. Now we will cover each step of the operating round in more detail. In the first step, you may lay or upgrade the track. That means you may either lay one yellow tile, or in later phases you may upgrade one of the existing tiles. This step is optional, so if you don't want to, you don't have to lay or upgrade the track. When the company operates for the first time in the game, take this home station marker and place it on the designated space on the game board. Then you may lay the track. If your home tile is empty, you must first lay a yellow city tile on that space. If your home tile is pre-printed, then you have two options based on the game phase. You may either extend the track or potentially upgrade the pre-printed tile. I'll talk about upgrades in a minute. When you lay a new tile, it must be yellow tile and you must extend the route coming from one of your stations. When you lay a tile on the hex with the city, the tile must contain the city. When you lay a tile on a town, the tile must contain a town, which is this small black line. When you lay a tile on a hex with two towns, the tile must also contain two towns. If the hex is empty, you may only place a plain track there. When you lay a tile on a hex which is marked by certain letters, like here DC, you may only use the tile with the same letters, and vice versa. This tile may only be used on this hex. It may never be used anywhere else. The same would apply for this double O hex. When laying or upgrading the track, you may not pass through the city which is fully occupied by stations of other companies. So in this example, this green company would not be able to lay the tile like this, because that route is blocked in this city. If that city tile would have any empty spaces, the route would be free. You may never lay a tile which makes the track run off the hex grid into these gray areas, or even into the red area without an arrow. However, you may lay a tile which runs into another tile, but it's not connected. And finally, if you lay a tile on a hex with this pre-printed costs for the mountains or for the river here, the operating company must pay that cost from its treasury. When the game enters its green or brown or gray phase, you may upgrade existing tiles. To upgrade, remove the old tile and replace it with the new tile of the upgraded color. The old tile is now again available for use. When upgrading, you always upgrade yellow tiles to green tiles. Green can be only upgraded to brown, and brown can be upgraded to gray. When you upgrade the tile, you must preserve all the existing tracks. So essentially, you're just building additional tracks on the tile. When you upgrade cities with station markers, those station markers remain in place. You can find the tile upgrade chart at the back of the rulebook. When you upgrade the track, some part of the new track must be the extension of the company route. Therefore, upgrading the tile like this would not be allowed, because the company may not use any part of the new track. You can also upgrade the city if you can use the track on the new tile. When you upgrade the tile which is on the hex with the terrain cost, you don't have to pay that terrain cost again. The only exception is the pre-printed yellow tile with this terrain cost. In this example, when upgrading to the green tile, you would have to pay those terrain costs. If you would then upgrade it to the brown tile, you would not have to pay the terrain costs again. Keep in mind that when you upgrade the tile, you may not have any part of the new track running off the grid or into any of these pre-printed tiles. So in this case, you can only upgrade the tile like this. Finally, you may have noticed these symbols on some hexes. These spaces are blocked by private companies. If the corresponding private company belongs to any player, so it's owned by a player, It means that this small private company still runs its operations historically on these two spaces, and no tracks can be built on those spaces until that private company is bought by any public company or if it closes at the start of the phase 5. As soon as the private company is owned by the public company, those spaces are now free and any player can build the tracks there. However, those private companies have special abilities, and those special abilities can now be used by the owning public company. In the second step, after building the track, optionally you may build one station. You may only place a station in the city which is on your route, and you can have maximum one station in each city. These city spaces are reserved for the companies. These are home stations of companies which have not floated yet, so even if you lay track there, you would not be able to place your station marker in that city. To remind players of that, it's best to place one of the tokens of that unfloated company next to the city space to indicate that the city is not occupied, the route would be free, however, this city space would be reserved for this company. If the city gets upgraded, one of those spaces would be still reserved for the company, but the other one may be available for players to place their stations. When you build stations, you have to pay for building these stations. The first token, first station, is free. It's a mandatory action. And when you build the next station, you have to build the cheapest one, and the costs are indicated below the space from which you take that station. Since placing the home station is free and it's a mandatory action, you may place the second station marker in the same operating turn. In subsequent rounds, you may only build one home station per operating round. In the next step, the company has to run its trains. There are 6 types of trains in the game. 5 of them have a number in the top left hand corner, and the 6th one has the letter D, which is a diesel train. And these numbers indicate how many revenue locations that train can visit. Revenue locations are these cities, those are tiles with a large white circle, towns represented by this small black line, and these red off-board areas. So the train with number 2 can only visit 2 revenue locations, train with number 3 can visit 3 locations, and so on, and the diesel train can visit unlimited number of locations. When the company first operates, it will have no train at all. In all subsequent operating rounds, it must run all its trains. Trains can only run along the company routes. Route is a continuous track which includes at least one of the company's station markers. Although the route must include the company station marker, it doesn't have to start or end in that city. So one of the routes of this green company can start here, go like this, and end over here. When the route includes these off-board areas, the route must either start or stop there. Company route may not pass through the blocked city. That's a city which is fully occupied by station markers of other companies, but the company route may start or end in such a city. One route may not visit the same city more than once. However, only on these double O tiles you may visit both cities. So one of the routes of this yellow company may start here, follow through this city, and go to this city. The route may not use the same segment of track more than once. So if the route would start in this city and move along the track to this one, you may not return back to this city because this segment of track would be used more than once. Furthermore, on the tiles like this, trains can never do the sharp turn and continue like this. They must always follow their original direction. You can only change the direction in the cities like this, so the route may go from here to this city and then follow this path. So when the company runs its trains, each train must be on a separate route. That means the routes of those trains must never share any segment of track. However, those routes may go through the same city as long as they come in and get out using different tracks. So here we have one 2 train and one 3 train. If the 3 train would start in this location, then visit this location and then continue to this one, Those are 3 revenue locations. The 2 train may not start in this city and go to this location because those routes would share this segment of track. However, that 2 train may start in this city and go like this. Although those 2 routes would use the same city, they would use different track segments. Each route generates revenue for the company, and that revenue is the sum of the values of the locations visited by the train. For example, a 3 train visiting this city, and this town would earn 10, 30, and 30, that's $70. The value of these red offboard locations changes with the game phase. This is the value in the yellow phase, this one in the green phase, brown, and gray. So the 3 train visiting these 3 locations in the green phase would generate 50 plus 10 plus 30, 90 revenue. After the company runs all its trains, sum up all the values of those routes, and those are earnings of the company in that operating round. These earnings are received from the bank. Now, the company has 2 options what to do with those earnings. The first option is to withhold all the earnings. That means all the money remains in the company. If you do that, the market price of the company moves 1 space left. The same applies if the earnings would be 0, which is in the first operating round of the company. If the marker should move left, but it cannot, instead it moves 1 space down. The second option is to pay out the money to the shareholders. Each shareholder will receive 10% of those earnings for each share they own. In other words, this player has 4 shares, so he would receive 40% of the earnings. For easier calculation, you can use this revenue tracker and one of the company markers to indicate what's the revenue for the given round. And now the first number is the revenue for 10% of shares, second number for a 20%, 30%, and so on and so forth. So if the earnings were 160, 10% is 16, and that's the number you receive for each share. So for these 4 shares, the player receives 4 times 16, that is $64. If the company has any shares in the bank pool, the dividends for those shares are paid out to the company. So in our example, that would be $32 that would go to the company treasury. There is no payout for the shares in the initial public offering. If the company pays out the dividends, the market price moves 1 space to the right. If the marker would have to move right, but it cannot, instead it moves 1 space up. In the next step of the operating round, the active company may buy 1 or more trains. You may buy these available trains from the bank, or you can buy the train from another company, but with the consent of the president of that company. Usually, both companies have the same president. Occasionally, there might be some trains in the bank pool as well. When the operating company buys trains, it may only use the money from its treasury. The president of the company may never contribute to buying the trains. When you buy the train or trains from the bank, you must always buy the cheapest one for the face value. In this situation, you would have to buy this 3 train for $180. Pay the money from the company treasury to the bank, then take the train and place it on the company charter. If the company wants to buy the train from another company, it can buy any of those trains. However, this time, the minimum price is $1, but there's no maximum, so if you want, you can even spend all the money of that company. This is actually a very important tactical maneuver in the game. But remember, the minimum price is $1, so if this company would also like to buy this train, now it's not possible because it has no money at all. If you buy the train from the bank pool, you can buy any available train, it doesn't have to be the cheapest one, and you always buy the train for the face value. Now, before we move on, we have to talk about the game phases. They are printed on the company charters and also on the player aid card. In 18X's games, trains represent technological advancement in the history. At the start of the game, only the yellow 2 trains are available, and that's why the initial phase of the game is the yellow phase or 2 phase. Each stock round is followed by only 1 operating round, and then it goes back to another stock round. And there's one more important element of the game, and it's called train limit, which is 4 trains in this initial phase. Train limit is the maximum number of trains the company can have. If the company is at this limit, it may not buy any more trains. When all the 2 trains are sold out and the first 3 train is bought from the bank, the game enters the green phase. That's also indicated by the green color of the 3 train and also on the company charter. Each stock round is followed by 2 operating rounds, and green tiles become available as well. In addition to that, with the phase number 3, corporation may buy private companies. I will explain this in a minute. Then, when the first 4 train is bought from the bank, it triggers a very important event in the game. It's called rusting the trains. As indicated at the bottom of the card, the 2 train is rusted by the 4 train. You have this information on the company charter too. So, when the first 4 train is bought, all 2 trains are eliminated from the game from all the companies. In addition to that, when the first 4 train is bought, the train limit is reduced down to 3. When the company has more trains than the train limit, it must choose and discard its trains, and these are discarded to the bank pool, until the company has the number of trains which is within that limit. Then, when the first 5 train is bought by any player, the game enters the brown phase, and first of all private companies are removed from the game. Stock rounds are now followed by 3 operating rounds, and brown tiles become available. Then, when the first 6 train is bought, all the 3 trains are rusted by this 6th train, so they are all removed from the game. And there is a small exceptional rule now. Although there is still one 6th train available, players may also buy the diesel trains. When the first diesel train is bought, it rusts all the 4 trains and removes them from the game, and the game enters the gray phase and gray tiles are available. When the company buys trains, it can buy as many trains as it can afford, however, only up to the current train limit. You may not buy more trains, even though buying that train would rust other trains and the company would remain in the train limit. This is not allowed since the company is at the train limit, it may not buy additional trains. However, there is one exception, again related to the diesel trains. The face value of diesel trains is $900, but you can get it for $700 if you trade one of your existing trains for that diesel train. Usually you want to trade in your 4 train and get the diesel for $700, and you can do this even when you are at the train limit, because this is considered to be the exchange of the 4 train for the diesel train. Obviously, this triggers the gray phase, and that means that all other 4 trains will be permanently rusted. If the company has no trains in this step of the operating round, which usually happens in the very first operating round of the company, but also may happen later in the game, the company must buy the train. This is another critical rule of the game. This rule applies if the company has a legal route where it can operate the train, and the legal route must contain at least 2 revenue locations. That means that if the company intentionally skips laying track and it doesn't have any legal route, which means it may not operate any trains, that company is not obliged to buy a train. This is another interesting tactical element, and I'll talk about it at the end of the video. But as soon as any player builds a route to that home station of the company, at the end of the next operating round, that company now must have a train. If the company must buy the train, but it doesn't have enough money, then this is the only situation in the game where the president of that company must contribute with their own money. You may buy the train from the bank, or if there are any trains in the bank pool, you may also choose the trains from the bank pool. You don't have to, you may, but if you do, you must choose the cheapest option. Then, after buying the train, spend all the money from the company treasury, and then president has to pay the difference. Now, if even the president doesn't have enough money, the president must start selling the shares one by one but only until he has enough. When selling shares, the presidency of some companies may change, and the president may even sell the shares of the company where he is actually buying the trains, but the presidency of that company may not change, so this player must remain the president of that company. When selling the shares, use the standard rules for that, so the stock price will move down. If after selling all the sellable shares, the president would still not have enough money to finance the train, that player goes bankrupt, the game ends immediately, and you determine the winner using the rules that I will be describing in a minute. If the company must buy a train, it may buy the train from another company with the consent of the president of that company, but that company is never forced to do so. That means the president of that company may simply decide to finance the train from his own pocket. During these green phases, phase 3 and 4, anytime during the operating turn of the active company, the company may buy the private companies from the president of that company. It may buy these private companies for half the face value up to double the face value. So in this example, it can be from $10 up to $40. The money goes from the company treasury to the player's personal reserve. At the start of any operating round, these private companies now pay the revenue to that company, and the company may also use the special abilities of these privates. If those private companies blocked any spaces on the map, like here, any player can now lay the track there. Just to emphasize, these special abilities of the private companies can only be used by the corporation. It may never be used by the players themselves. When all companies perform their operations, move to the next operating round, if any, and if you have to move back to the stock round, you have to export the train first, but only in the yellow and green phases. To export the train, simply discard the next available train. This may actually trigger the change of the game phase. Once these brown permanent trains are available, trains are not exported anymore. The game can end in two different ways. First, if the initial bank runs out of money, so the bank breaks, or if any player goes bankrupt. If the player goes bankrupt, the game ends immediately. If the bank breaks and it happens during the operating rounds, finish the set of operating rounds and then the game ends. If the bank breaks during the stock round, then finish the next set of operating rounds and then the game ends. If the initial bank breaks, it just triggers the end of the game. Put more money in the bank so that you can keep paying out additional money. Now, calculate the personal wealth of each player. First, look at the stock prices and the actual market prices for each company. For example, the Strasbourg Railroad is worth $200 per share, and then multiply that value by the number of shares in your portfolio. So in this example, 4 shares each worth $200, that's $800 for the gray player for the Strasbourg Railroad Company shares. Do the same math for all other shares in your portfolio, add your own personal cash, and the total number is your personal wealth. The player with the highest personal wealth is the winner. Remember, money in the corporations are worth nothing. In this section of the video, I'm going to talk about some shenanigans in the game. Those are some tactical moves that may not be obvious just from learning the rules. Although we have briefly mentioned the first one, dumping the company. If you are the president of the company and another player owns at least 20% of the company, and during the stock round you act before that player, you don't have to have the priority deal, you just have to act before that player, you may sell your shares and dump the presidency, dump the company on another player. Why would you do that? Because if you are the president of 2 companies, during the operating rounds, you may siphon off the funds from one company to another, for example by buying a very cheap train for all the money, And then you keep the other company, obviously very rich company, and leave the other company, the poor company, for other players. So be careful when you buy shares of another company where you are not the president. The second shenanigan is called the Briefcase Company, and it uses the same siphoning effect. If you start a company but intentionally don't lay any track, that company doesn't have to have trains. Now, if you have another company, you can use the money from this new company and buy the train from your second company. And now you can use the money in this second company to buy some expensive train. If that rusts the train in your new company, it's not really a problem because the company doesn't have any track and so it doesn't have to have any trains. Essentially, that company only exists on a paper and that's why it's called the Briefcase Company. But be careful, if any player builds a track to your home station, you will have to buy the train. And finally, something more subtle, the order of the companies in the operating round is determined by the market price. The company with the highest market price goes first, company with the lowest market price goes last. There may be situations in the game where you may need to change the order of those companies, so during the stock round, you may very carefully buy and then sell the shares of the company, which drops the price of that company down. With this subtle move, the Strasbourg Railroad dropped from the first position in the operating round to the last position. If you would be the president of the blue company, the B&O, you may even try to drop down the PRR, the green company, one space, which means it would operate after the Strasbourg. And in this situation, B&O company would act first, then Strasbourg, then PRR. So from going last in this situation, the BOO company managed to become the first operating company in the next operating round. Obviously, other players may try to do the same. So that's how you play 18 Chesapeake. If you would have any questions or comments, I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. If you like the series, please subscribe. You can even support the channel on the Patreon page. You've been watching Game in a Nutshell. My name is Branislav Berec and hope to see you next time.